Então, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite. A gente vai oficialmente agora começar a nossa discussão, o nosso seminário. A gravação já está acontecendo. Esse é o nosso quinto encontro do seminário sobre neoliberalismo e dinâmicas migratórias, uma parceria do Instituto Diáspora Brasil com o Instituto Lula. Mas antes de começar, eu vou dar algumas instruções gerais. Se vocês tiverem alguma dúvida, por favor, escrevam para a gente aí no chat. A gente está pedindo para todo mundo manter seu microfone fechado para facilitar o nosso diálogo. No final, a gente vai ter um momento de conversa, de perguntas e respostas e comentários. Esse seminário, essa discussão está sendo gravada para ser editada e publicada depois no YouTube do Instituto Lula. E existe interpretação disponível. Se você tiver no computador, você vai ver um desenho de um globo escrito interpretação e você escolhe o idioma em que você quer ouvir essa discussão, em português ou em inglês. Então, também vou incentivar todos que se apresentem ali no chat, coloquem seu nome, a cidade de onde estão falando. Eu me chamo Mariana. Eu estou falando aqui de Boston e estou muito alegre de estar aqui hoje recebendo a professora Aviva e recebendo também todos vocês, amigos, colegas, pesquisadores, parceiros que a gente tem construído ao longo dessa jornada, desse ciclo de estudos. Hoje, como eu falei, é o quinto seminário, onde a gente está tentando discutir e entender a imigração de um ponto de vista estrutural, também observando os movimentos do capital, além de tentar providenciar e construir junto um entendimento maior sobre o fenômeno transnacional. A gente teve uma conversa com algumas conversas já aconteceram, com a professora Peggy Levitt falando sobre sistemas sociais transnacionais. Tivemos discussões muito especializadas com pesquisadores especializados nos temas de circulação de cérebro, a fuga de cérebros, uma discussão aplicada sobre o transnacionalismo com meu colega Álvaro Lima, que está aqui. O professor Alex Brum conversou com a gente sobre o histórico das políticas públicas brasileiras de vinculação das comunidades no exterior. Hoje a gente tem a professora Aviva falando sobre, acredito um pouco sobre a dinâmica da imigração e um projeto racialista. E a gente vai encerrar com os nossos colegas economistas, o professor Ricardo Antunes e o professor Márcio Postman, vão fazer os dois últimos encontros, analisando o fenômeno de imigração desse ponto de vista estrutural do capital. O professor Ricardo vai falar sobre a questão da ilegalidade do trabalho e o professor Postman vai conversar com a gente em maio sobre os regimes de acumulação e os fluxos migratórios. A gente pede desculpa, inclusive, porque esse seminário do professor Postman teve que ser reagendado, então o nosso ciclo vai se estender até maio. Eu acho que o professor Luiz, do Instituto Lula, está com problema de conexão, está tentando entrar. Se ele aparecer na sala e eu não ver, por favor, podem chamar a minha atenção. Mas eu vou chamar o meu colega Álvaro Lima, acho que para falar um pouco do Instituto Diáspora Brasil e apresentar a professora Aviva. Álvaro, por favor.
Obrigado, Mariana. É um prazer grande estar aqui, a professora Aviva, e estar com todos vocês de volta nesse ciclo que pretende abrir a discussão sobre os vários aspectos da imigração em geral e da imigração brasileira em particular. A professora Aviva Chomsky é coordenadora de estudos latino-americanos e caribenhos na Universidade de Salem, Massachusetts. Ela tem uma extensa produção acadêmica sobre imigração, especificamente a imigração indocumentada, abordando os temas de colonialismo, desenvolvimento econômico, raça e trabalho, e tem também, mais importante, uma posição bastante militante junto a comunidades imigrantes, tem uma militância muito grande em relação à América Latina, em particular América Central, e eu queria, antes de passar a palavra a ela, agradecer pela generosidade dela, pelo seu tempo. Ela é uma pessoa bastante ocupada, mas sempre nos atende com muita a bondade, generosidade, tanto ao nosso Instituto agora, mas também quanto ao Grupo da Mulher Brasileira, anos atrás, e sempre se dispõe a trabalhar e conversar com as diversas comunidades. Eu espero que todos nós tiremos o maior proveito desse encontro com a professora, e eu passo a palavra para ela. Antes disso, eu queria agradecer, o Luiz não está aqui, agradecer a parceria com o Instituto Lula, que tem sido uma parceria bastante interessante, proveitosa para nós, no sentido de que esses encontros ajudam a pôr na pauta, no Brasil, a questão da imigração, a questão da diáspora brasileira, que foi tão não só desconhecida e deixada de lado durante os últimos 4 anos da administração passada, mas foi também desumanizada e sofremos muito, um retrocesso muito grande em relação, desde do golpe da presidente Dilma, em relação à relação do governo brasileiro com a nossa comunidade no exterior. Nós esperamos que, com o novo governo do presidente Lula, a gente retome e reconstrua todo um trabalho que foi feito durante anos por várias e várias mãos e cabeças de imigrantes brasileiros espalhados pelo mundo. Muito obrigado, e eu passo a palavra à professora Aviva Chomsky.
Thank you so much, Alvaro. Bom dia a todos e todas. Muito obrigada ao Instituto Lula e ao Instituto Diáspora Brasil por me convidarem para falar com vocês hoje. Eu gostaria de poder falar bem e suficiente o português para fazer minha apresentação. Português foi meu curso principal na faculdade, mas eu não estudo, não uso essa língua há anos. Então, terei que falar em inglês. Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, I wish I could speak enough Portuguese to do more than that, but unfortunately, I can't. So I'm going to show you some slides. I'm going to try to keep my presentation brief, but I am going to cover a really long time period because I think that in order to understand immigration today, we really have to rewrite the whole way we think about US immigration history. So let me move this to slideshow. So yeah, I'm actually going to talk about, somebody needs to turn off their
Sorry.
microphone.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay. The immigration debate as a racial project from the very first arrival of Europeans to the United States until today. But I will go over this very long time period very quickly, but just from the perspective of thinking about how much the racial project of settler colonialism, that is the formation of British colonialism and then followed by the formation of the United States, has been a racial project. And what role has the immigration debate played in this racial project? How has the racial project shaped and continues to shape the immigration debate today? So I'm sure we've all heard many times that the United States is a country of immigrants. And I actually want to challenge what we mean by that. I think when most people say the United States is a country of immigrants, they have in mind something like what former President Barack Obama had in mind. He said, he said it many times, but I just pulled out one quote of his. "We share the view that one of the greatest strengths of the United States has always been its willingness to welcome new immigrants to our shores. That's what made us unique and special." So when people talk about the United States as a country of immigrants, they're generally using that with the idea that we should be pro-immigrant today because we have been pro-immigrant in the past, and immigrants have contributed to the United States, and our willingness to welcome immigrants is what makes us great. So we should continue to welcome immigrants. Now, while I agree that we should welcome immigrants, I don't agree with that formulation. And I think that that formulation is not helpful to us. And this talk is going to tell you why. Another view that challenges that idea of the United States as a so-called country of immigrants comes from Jill Lepore, a historian at Harvard, who wrote a recent book called These Truths, A History of the United States. And she points out that between 1500 and 1800, roughly 2.5 million Europeans moved to the Americas. They were the immigrants. They carried 12 million Africans there by force. Those 12 million are left out of the story if we talk about the United States as a country of immigrants. And as many as 50 million Native Americans died, chiefly of disease. They are also left out of the narrative when we call the United States a country of immigrants. And I want to go, so the country of immigrants narrative is a racialized narrative. And let me just go back to Barack Obama's statement for a moment. He says that we have always welcomed new immigrants to our shores. What he means is that we have always welcomed new white immigrants to our Atlantic shore. We have never welcomed immigrants who came to other shores like the Pacific coast. Asian immigrants coming to the Pacific coast were not welcomed. Immigrants moving north from Mexico were not welcomed. The immigrants who were welcomed were white European immigrants. In fact, by US law, and for most of this country's history, only white people could legally be considered immigrants. People of color who were already present in the United States or who migrated to the United States were not immigrants. So even if this sentiment is being expressed by a person of color, it is a white supremacist sentiment. It is a racialized sentiment, the idea that we have always welcomed immigrants. And this kind of use of to our shores, well, even that means that we're welcoming Europeans who come on boats from Europe, not other immigrants who come in other ways to the United States. So I want to go back to what I call a white supremacist map of North America in 1700, just to show how much this white supremacist narrative has shaped the way we are taught to think about our history in this country. And there's a couple of things I want to point out about this map, and I'm sure many of you have seen similar sorts of maps. This is a map that kind of follows that idea that we've always welcomed immigrants to our shores. You will note that it shows English settlements, English influence, French settlements, French influence, Spanish settlements, Spanish influence. That is, this is a white people's map of North America in 1700. Like Barack Obama, it's telling us that the histories of white people are the important histories to know. Obviously, white people did not constitute the majority of people in any of these places in North America in 1700. And when they say English influence, French influence, obviously they're influencing somebody, but we don't want to mention who they are influencing because we want to draw a map that only privileges white people. But another thing that I want to point out is that the areas of European settlement in 1700 are very, very small. Yet when we learn the history of the United States, we learn about those areas of European settlement, especially about those areas of English settlement, as if that is the history that we need to learn about. And of course, the history of the white immigrants who are being welcomed to those areas of English settlement. That is the master narrative of the history of the United States. And of course, the large numbers of Africans who were forcibly brought to the United States or to North America are also completely left out, invisibilized on this map. Again, this is an immigrants map. If immigrants are defined as white people, which they are in US history. The English settlers were very pro-immigrant. That is, they were pro-white. That is, they wanted to increase the white population. They were quite aware that they were a small minority in a continent inhabited primarily by people of color, and they were very interested in increasing the white population. And they make this clear in what we call the American Revolution, but what some historians actually call the counter-revolution of 1776, because far from being an anti-colonial revolution, what we call the American Revolution was a pro-colonial revolution. It was a revolution carried out by the colonizers themselves. It was not a revolution carried out by the people who were colonized in North America. There were other revolutions carried out by Native American and African inhabitants of North America who were colonized by the British, but that's not who carried out the American Revolution. The American Revolution was led by land speculators and slaveholders who wanted to expand both the taking of native land and the enslaving of African peoples. That is, they were colonizers. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, it actually talks about immigration. And one of the complaints of these colonizers against the King of Great Britain, and the first bullet point there is just, I'll read it aloud so it can be translated into Portuguese. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. This is just the preamble, but then the declaration goes on to list all of the things that these colonizers are objecting to about the King of Great Britain. And I'm particularly interested in one that you may not have been exposed to. He, that is King George, has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. What they mean, of course, is immigration that is bringing more white settler colonizers to the states. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for the naturalization of foreigners. That is, the Crown is making it harder for new arrivals from England to become citizens, refusing to pass other laws to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. That is, making it more difficult for us to take more native lands. Now, why is the British Crown kind of pulling back from its colonial endeavor in North America? That is pulling back on promoting more English migration, pulling back on militarily supporting the colonizers who want to take new native lands. It's pulling back not for moral reasons or because it's opposing colonialism, but simply because the North American colonies are not very profitable for Britain. It's much more interested in putting its resources into its Caribbean colonies and its Asian colonies, in particular India. So don't read any kind of humanitarian or moral positions in what the British Crown is doing. And yet it's the British Crown pulling back from its military support for its colonizers in North America is one of the main reasons why they want to be independent. And one particular thing that really outrages the colonizers, and I call them colonizers rather than colonists, which I think is kind of a euphemism. They are colonizers, people like George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they're colonizers. One particular thing that the British Crown does that outrages the colonizers is the Proclamation of 1763. That is just about a decade before the colonizers rise up demanding independence, in which the British Crown agrees to draw this line, this red line that you see in the map on the left, limiting English colonial expansion and recognizing Native American sovereignty west of the line. Now, the colonizers want to make England and bringing more English people over to populate this land with white people and drive out the the native population. And they not only say this is what they want to do, they actually do it. If you look at the map on the right, expansion of colonized territory between 1782 and 1802, once they are independent, they immediately go about expanding westward. And that, what you see in that map, is just the beginning, because in fact, the entire 19th century is the period of what we are taught to call the Indian Wars or Manifest Destiny. It is a century of ongoing and permanent colonial warfare against the native populations of the entire continent. A century of war follows English colonizers' independence in North America. Independence is just the beginning of colonial wars in North America. The vast majority of the continent is inhabited by autonomous sovereign indigenous peoples in 1782. And here you see a little bit, this I guess I would call another white supremacist map, where you see the European claims to North American territory. So in 1803, when the new country of the United States purchases the Louisiana Purchase from France, there are really no French people, or a very small number of French people in this large territory. The vast majority of the population is Native Americans. The same thing with the Mexican cession, the Spanish cessions, the Oregon Territory Treaty with Great Britain. That is, colonizers are sitting down and making deals among themselves to transfer native lands from one to another. And the project of the United States is to populate these newly, supposedly acquired lands with white people, but that also requires what I call the century of permanent warfare to conquer the native populations in order to colonize these territories with white immigrants. So the fact that they like immigrants doesn't really say anything about how multicultural and open-minded they are. It says the exact opposite. It says that they are engaged in a project of white settler colonialism and the expansion of African slavery on native lands. We don't really need to look at that one, but we can also see the white supremacist project of immigration in the ways that the United States has legislated citizenship. Very early after the foundation of the country, the United States passes an act to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Remember that in the Declaration of Independence, they complained, one of their complaints was that the British Crown made it too hard for new white immigrants to naturalize. Well, the new country wants to make it as easy as possible. So the first Naturalization Act, passed in 1790, states, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Well, I bet, except for the free white person part, I bet a lot of immigrants in the United States today would be very happy to see something like that. But note that that open attitude towards immigration only existed when immigration was legally defined as being the movement of free white persons. Nobody who was not white could naturalize in the United States. Citizenship was restricted to white persons, and white persons were encouraged with open arms to migrate, again, because of the racial project of creating a white country on lands inhabited by people of color. This act of naturalization was governed citizenship for almost the first 100 years of US history. It's only changed after the Civil War. And it's changed in a very radical way after the Civil War. Or I should say, in some ways, a very radical way. Because after the Civil War, the US federal government acknowledges that something must be done about the African and Afro-descended populations that have been liberated from slavery, or that have liberated themselves from slavery, and that up until now have been deprived of citizenship. So citizenship is extended in two different ways, two different kind of contradictory ways. First of all, Congress passes the 14th Amendment and creates the radical notion of birthright citizenship, that citizenship is not based only on race, it's based on birthplace. This is quite common in the Americas today. It's not that common in Europe still, but the 14th Amendment reads, in part, all persons, note that first word, all. It sounds very inclusive, doesn't it? But just wait. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and here comes the qualification that shows you that that all isn't as inclusive as it might have sounded, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, just hold those words in your mind, there's a qualification to the all, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So who is left out of birthright citizenship? Who is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Native Americans. Native Americans are explicitly excluded from birthright citizenship. Now, what Congress has in mind when they create birthright citizenship is that birthright citizenship will be extended to African and Afro-descended peoples who are born in the United States. They really aren't thinking about anybody else. And this becomes clear, not only because of the exclusion of Native Americans there, but it also becomes clear when we look at the Naturalization Act that follows the 14th Amendment 2 years later. So remember that naturalization was previously restricted to free white persons. In 1870, the act is amended with the Naturalization Act of 1870. It says, be it further enacted that the naturalization laws are hereby extended to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, but nobody else. That means that Native Americans who are excluded from birthright citizenship are also excluded from naturalization. And if you think about what is happening in the United States in 1870, it leaves out some other very important groups of people also, because starting after the Civil War, or really starting after the gold rush, new groups of immigrants, not considered immigrants, but new groups of people, new groups of migrants are coming into the United States, especially from Asia, especially from China, but also from other parts of Asia, coming to the Pacific, and from Mexico. But those people are not covered under the naturalization laws because they are neither free white persons, nor are they aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. And I should just mention, in terms of the racial nature of these laws, that in the aftermath of 3 centuries of enslavement and the Civil War, there's basically nobody from Africa trying to migrate to the United States. People in Africa do not see the United States as a land of opportunity or freedom. So although people from Africa are in theory allowed to naturalize, the new Naturalization Act actually prohibits the naturalization of the peoples of color who are migrating to the United States and allows naturalization only for people of color who are not migrating to the United States. So where are these new white immigrants supposed to go? And how does immigration, white immigration, continue to be associated with the taking of native lands? This is a poster from 1911, drawing the connection very clearly that the settler colonial project, the military project of taking Indian land, is very closely connected. It is the other side of the coin of the settler colonial project of fostering white immigration and land. So again, this comes from the Department of the Interior in the year 1911, and it very openly advertises Indian land for sale. Who is this advertisement aimed at? Well, it's aimed at white immigrants who have come to the East Coast. It's aimed at newly arriving immigrants at Ellis Island, those ones who Barack Obama was so proud of us for welcoming. And it's aimed at Europeans. That is, these are distributed by US consular offices in places like Italy, Poland, to encourage white immigrants to come to the United States. You can get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title, possession within 30 days. Land, arable land, irrigated, grazing, agriculture, dry farming. The new country, not so new anymore, is pouring resources into developing lands for white colonization still in 1910, 1911. It's estimated that 350,000 acres will be offered for sale. And it lists the lands that were sold in 1910 in the various states of the Midwest and Western parts of the country. So I want to look a little bit more closely at some of the laws that take native land and that encourage white immigration and that make it clear that immigration of people of color is not welcome. The Northwest Ordinance, way back in 1787, claiming British rights to dispossess native populations in newly taken lands and repopulate them with white immigrants. The Homestead Act in 1862 that specifically offers land to white immigrants in these territories of the West as they are being colonized. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. I pointed out that the Chinese were excluded from the Naturalization Act, and yet they were migrating in large numbers. Congress was okay. This points up to a contradiction between the 14th Amendment and the Naturalization Act. The Naturalization Act tries to continue to restrict citizenship to only white people and grudgingly people of African descent. But the 14th Amendment leaves a loophole by which people of color can, who are not Native American at least, can gain citizenship by being born in the United States. So it takes Congress about 12 years to realize this contradiction that we don't want Chinese people to be able to get citizenship. That's why we excluded them from the Naturalization Act. But the babies of Chinese people who were born in the United States are citizens by birth. Well, we can't have that because we have to be a white country. Therefore, the solution is to prohibit first the migration of Chinese women in 1873, which I left out of here. And then when Congress realizes that Chinese men are somehow managing to have babies even when there are no Chinese women around, the exclusion of all Chinese migration in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Even as the Chinese are being excluded, Congress passes the Dawes Act in 1887 that breaks up the remaining Indian reservations in the West into small allotments, individual allotments, putting the majority of reservation land on sale to white immigrants. Now, even after the Chinese are excluded, other groups of Asians continue to come to the United States from Japan, from India. And in 1917, Congress passes its largest exclusion, creating a significant portion of the world's territory as the Asiatic Barred Zone. And in 1921 and 1924, this Asiatic Barred Zone is formalized in the new Immigration Act. A version of it is passed in, a temporary version of it is passed in 1921, the final version in 1924, which states, no alien ineligible to citizenship shall be admitted to the United States. This is the broadest exclusion. And who is an alien ineligible to citizenship? Well, that goes back to that 1870 Naturalization Act that we were just looking. Anyone who is not a free white person or a person of African nativity or African descent. And it goes on to clearly define the term ineligible to citizenship, when used in reference to any individual, includes an individual who is debarred from becoming a citizen of the United States. So that Naturalization Act of 1870 leads to a whole, in combination with birthright citizenship, leads to this whole series of laws to prevent anyone excluded from the Naturalization Act from coming to the United States at all. Now, the United States continues to welcome white immigrants, but no non-white immigrants. And I sort of summarize here. Basically, European countries got quotas in 1924. Asia was defined as close to 3/4 of the planet's territory, and all so-called Asians were deemed aliens ineligible to citizenship. And Mexico and the rest of the Americas were not covered by the act. Now, why were Mexico and the Americas left out of all this exclusionary legislation? And I should point out that during this time, basically up until the 1960s, the vast majority of Latin American migration into the US did come from Mexico, a smaller amount from the Caribbean. It's really after the 1960s that places like Brazil and Central America and other Latin American countries start sending large number of migrants. Now, why are Mexicans still allowed to come to the United States if they are ineligible to citizenship? Well, because they are not admitted as immigrants. They are considered seasonal, deportable migrant workers. It's a lot easier to deport Mexicans than it is to deport people who come across the Pacific. It's a lot cheaper for US authorities. As the West starts to industrialize its agriculture and its industry in the second half of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, it has huge labor needs, and Mexican migrant workers are decided on as the best way to fulfill those labor needs without upsetting the racial composition of the country. So I want to just look specifically at how Mexicans, and by extension, as the 20th century progresses, other Latin Americans have been constructed by US immigration law. 1848, the Mexican-American War, the United States defeats Mexico, and Congress debates how much of Mexico's land do we want to take? And the debate centers around, we want as much resource-rich land as possible, but we really don't want very many Mexicans. So the decision about where to draw the line is based precisely on the idea of the desire for land and the lack of desire for Mexican people, who were defined by Congress as a mongrel race. Quickly, the pattern of importing and deporting Mexicans as labor needs of US investors in the West and Southwest grow is established very, very early. And I just have a few examples here of the inviting and deporting Mexicans and how deeply that has been built into US law and US history. The first Bracero program, that is the Bracero program, was a temporary migrant labor program agreed upon by the United States and Mexican governments to send Mexican migrants on a temporary basis to work for particular employers during their seasonal needs, especially agricultural employers, and then deport them back to Mexico at the end of the season. Don't let them bring their families. Don't let them stay here long enough to give birth to any children. They should just come here to work. They are not potential citizens. They're wanted as workers, but not as citizens. In the 1930s, and we really see here with the so-called repatriation of Mexicans that took place in the 1930s and again in the 1950s, that Mexicans are racialized as non-white, and really, those who were deported, it was not based on citizenship, it was based on their racialization as Mexicans. There were just huge sweeps into workplaces, into agricultural locations, into places where Mexican and Mexican origin populations live, simply to deport people on the basis of being supposedly Mexican and not wanting and ensuring that they would not be eligible, even if they were US citizens, they were deported based on their racialization as Mexicans, not to be eligible for any of the social service programs that were being developed in the 1930s in the context of the Depression. During World War II, the second Bracero program, by the late 1950s, we have 400,000 Mexicans every year being imported and deported in this system of, yes, we want Mexican labor, but we don't want Mexican people. And then things really change in 1965. And this is where I'm going to actually end in 1965. This is my last slide, so I'm almost done. 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, or Hart-Celler Act of 1965, changes a lot of things and sets up the system under which we still operate today. So I'll take just a moment to talk about why immigration law was changed in 1965 and how those changes have affected Latin American immigrants. If you think about 1965, we're at the height of the Cold War, we're at the height of anti-colonial rebellions going on all over the world, and we're at the height of revolutionary resistance movements in the United States as well, of African Americans, of Native Americans, of Mexican Americans. The United States is confronting challenges to its hegemony worldwide and at home, its racial hegemony, and it's trying to promote itself as the paragon of equality and democracy, as opposed to the Soviet Union, which is actually the one supporting anti-colonial struggles in the third world that the United States is opposing. So there's a lot of reforms that happen in the 1960s, especially under the Johnson administration, to try to make the United States, to try to calm the rebellions in the United States and to try to make the United States look better on the world stage. Civil rights legislation, and reforming the immigration system, de-racializing the immigration system is another piece of this. So the Hart-Celler Act takes away all of the restrictions, the racial restrictions on immigration, and it simply puts a cap of 20,000 a year on every country in the world and promotes this as, okay, now we're finally treating everyone equally. However, this cap of 20,000 per year is still very racialized, because if you think about it, there's some parts of the world that are made up of a lot of very small countries, like Europe. So 20,000 a year works really well for people in small European countries that also have little demand for migration to the United States. You know, Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, all those little countries, they don't need those 20,000 visas every year. And there's so many of these little European countries that 20,000 a year per country still lets a lot of Europeans in. There are other parts of the world made up of very large countries like China and India, where a cap of 20,000 a year means that it's virtually impossible for any individual in China or India or the Philippines to hope to get one of those 20,000 a year. So it still discriminates against people of color, even while supposedly not discriminating against countries made up of people of color. But the other thing that the Hart-Celler Act does that is discriminatory is that it applies these caps to the Americas for the first time. So Mexican workers, remember, 400,000 Mexican workers every year were freely crossing the border to work and then return home. Now, 380,000 of those are turned into illegal immigrants because they exceed the cap. The workers still need the work. The employers still need the workers. They still need them to be deportable because the white country does not want them. But now the rationale for their deportability is that they have, with the stroke of a pen, been made illegal by imposing this cap on Mexico. So this is the end of my talk. If you want to know how immigration became illegal, it became illegal in, I mean, the term existed before, but the mass phenomenon of so-called illegal immigration came when Mexican workers were illegalized in 1965 as a continuation of the long racial project of making Mexican workers available to US employers, but preventing them from getting the benefits of citizenship or destabilizing white supremacy in the United States, as Mexicans, like other people of color, were not considered white. So that is the end of my talk. A little over time, but not too much, right?
Not too much. Foi muito impressionante. Acho que eu só vou dar um tempo para a Priscila, nossa intérprete, mudar a língua. Quero checar se está tudo bem com a interpretação antes de eu continuar. E eu vou pedir para todo mundo... Ok, that's good. Pedir para todo mundo aí desmutar o seu microfone e dar um aplauso para a professora. Muito obrigada, foi uma grande explicação, uma verdadeira história mesmo. Obrigada, professora. Tô um monte de informação na cabeça, assim, então vou guardar os meus comentários para mais para o final, para dar a chance de outros colegas também falarem. Então, o microfone tá aberto, pessoal. Para quem quiser fazer algum comentário.
While you were talking, I was seeing many other movements that wave through your talk. That one is kind of the growth and of the economy, and then the crisis, and how that also modulated when you get workers, when we don't get workers, and also kind of at the ideological side, there is also the transformation of people of color into whites by assimilation, the Irish, the Italians, and so there is that other process of continue to be a white country, which I thought was other aspects of how that story is weaved into this racial project, which I thought was very interesting. I think that with the last two talks that we will have, I think we will have more clear the kind of the need of capital for workers, and particularly for illegal immigrants, as they say, because you don't need, well, immigrants in general, because you don't need to raise your labor force. It comes from other side, from other societies. When I came to the US, I went to public school in Brazil, and I came here as an economist. I brought with me a subsidy of Brazilian taxpayers to the American economy. And if you are undocumented, also, I didn't need to be retired, even though I'm contributing to Social Security. So and the only country that I think lived on this model was South Africa during the colonial time, where Mozambique, Rhodesia will send workers to the mines of South Africa. They use it. If you got sick, they will send you back, and Portugal or England will send a new one, so that you just pay for what you use, which is it's a relation of exploitation at its almost worse as any relation of exploitation. So I thought it was fascinating, and my head was bringing these things together when we were going through the slides. Thank you. It was a very enlightening and interesting talk, and it's also very unusual somebody to refer to the Soviet Union, the role on decolonization and the wars of liberation, when this story also weaves the Emma Lazarus, this is a country of opportunity, and bring your poor, and today your venture capital, your doctors. And so thank you.
Thank you. Should I comment on each question, or?
Eu acho que a gente vai abrir para mais perguntas, aí depois fazer mais umas 3 ou 4,
Okay.
e eu quero encorajar todos em falar português por conta do nosso áudio. E a professora responde em inglês, por favor, mas só por causa da tecnologia. Então, eu vou convidar o Miguel, por favor, Miguel.
Professora Eve, muito obrigado pelas informações. Foi extremamente útil. Eu resido atualmente no Japão, mas sou da ascendência nipônica. E é importante lembrar que quando o bloqueio dos Estados Unidos para a migração asiática, isso colaborou para que os japoneses começassem a migrar para a América do Sul, a princípio para o Peru e para o Brasil. Hoje moram migrantes no Brasil, asiáticos, a maior colônia japonesa no Brasil. A minha pergunta é com relação a uma comparação sobre os 2 recentes governos norte-americanos e sobre como eles veem essa migração, de que forma que, qual a principal diferença de visão entre o governo Biden e o governo Trump. Obrigado.
É a pergunta do momento, Miguel. Pergunta mais quente. Núbia, por favor. Depois da Núbia, a Ana já pode emendar.
Olá a todos. Aviva, eu fico muito contente de ouvir suas palavras, todo o contexto que você... foi muita informação, e eu só queria pegar o gancho que o Alvaro falou, que sobre a migração dos mexicanos, algo assim que o Alvaro falou, e eu vejo assim que isso acontece há muitos anos, né? Há muitos anos acontece essa migração, os mexicanos passando pela fronteira e tendo dificuldades, crianças, adolescentes, adultos. Então, são coisas de anos atrás que se repetem até hoje, né? E nada foi modificado. Então, o que nós aqui presentes podemos fazer para que isso mude, né? Porque cada dia, cada vez é mais difícil com que essas pessoas possam trabalhar, porque é ilegal eles estarem em outro país, e a lei dos Estados Unidos é muito rígida, mais do que todos os outros países do nosso planeta. Então, como conciliar, como a gente pode resolver? Mesmo assim, na nossa reunião aqui, nós passamos nossas ideias, nossas conclusões, mas como podemos fazer para facilitar ou diminuir esse problema que é tão evidente e que dura tantos anos e que não houve mudanças? É isso. Obrigada pela oportunidade.
Então, posso entrar, Mariana? Pronto. Eu já cumprimentei a professora Aviva, fui aluna dela com muito orgulho na Saline State University, no meu mestrado, e para mim é um prazer muito grande estar aqui assistindo ela de novo e vendo a evolução do trabalho dela, né? E assim, no tempo em que eu participei das aulas delas, a gente ainda estava discutindo a questão da indocumentação, né? E de como os imigrantes se tornaram ilegais, os legais se tornaram ilegais. E assim, interessante ver essa construção, né, do projeto de imigração dos Estados Unidos como um projeto racial como um todo, né, desde o início da sua história. Então, assim, e fica muito claro, né, na exposição dela, na sua exposição, e eu tenho um aspecto que eu gostaria de ouvir, professora Aviva, o seu comentário, que também, pongando no que o Alvaro falou, né, essa narrativa da white supremacy foi tentada ser desconstruída, né, com a imigração e a aceitação, né, dos irlandeses, né, tornados brancos, a lei né, os direitos civis em 1968. Então, assim, na verdade, o que a gente tem observado e também dos estudos que fiz sobre a sua orientação, é que esses instrumentos da lei de imigração, esses instrumentos da lei de imigração como um projeto de recorte racial, na verdade, continuam de uma forma diferente, mas eles continuam, através dos seus formulários, através das suas leis, através da própria forma de abordagem, né? Mesmo que os direitos tenham evoluído. Então, assim, eu gostaria de ouvir o seu comentário a respeito disso. Obrigada.
Vou convidar o Alan, e aí na fala do Alan a gente encerra.
Não. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a very interesting talk, because I want to connect the dots. I know the professor is well aware that in 1856, I was born in Costa Rica, so we had a big battle against a doctor and a lawyer. His name was William Walker. And my understanding so far is that that was a private slavist enterprise to conquer our nations and to some sort of kind of annex our region to the southern states. But I have never been clear if that was supported by Washington, the Congress, and the politicians. I know Walker had influence. He was very educated. I even bought a book that he wrote. No, but that's my question, because I have that big doubt, because in my country it's being taught that that was a private enterprise, nothing to do with Washington. Thank you, and thank you so much for your brilliant exposition.
Tem uma pergunta no chat que eu quero compartilhar, e aí vou devolver para a professora Aviva para fazer seus comentários, suas reações por mais 15 minutos, se ela conseguir, mas pode falar mais se for necessário, a gente está no desejo de ouvir. A pergunta é do Rafael Pacheco, que está pedindo desculpas, que ele está dirigindo e participando, então ele enviou a pergunta por escrito, está agradecendo a sua apresentação, professora, mas a pergunta dele é: como essa ideia de um trabalhador ilegal indocumentado pode auxiliar ou dar um suporte no desenvolvimento social, nas políticas migratórias? E eu acho que eu também quero ouvir um pouquinho qual a sua perspectiva de políticas antirracistas no contexto de imigração, assim, como você está vendo isso? E eu devolvo para você, professora. Obrigada.
Okay, thank you all very much. Those are great questions. So I'll try to answer them all and not take too much time. I could talk all day trying to answer all of these questions.
And I'm sure that we can hear that all day.
Sorry?
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I wanted to start with Alvaro, who brought up the issue, and as did a couple of other people, of the Irish and Italians, and were they considered white? And I want to draw a distinction here between legal whiteness and social whiteness. That is, legally, under the law, they were defined as white. That was never a question. And that's why they were allowed to migrate in such large numbers during the period when only white migration was allowed. So they were never legally defined as non-white under US immigration law. It was the so-called mongrel races of Latin America and the Asiatic races that spanned all the way from the islands of Japan and the Philippines through East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East. And the courts did debate on where exactly to draw the line. You know, is somebody from Armenia considered white? Where does the line of Europe end and the line of Asia begin? Is someone from Syria considered white? Again, where does the line between Europe and Asia begin? Where does that line fall? But the Irish and the Italians, there was never a question. For the immigration law, they were white. And that's why we have such large numbers here. And they were actively recruited to come here to whiten the population. Now, then there's also social whiteness. And this is where many Anglo-Saxon Protestants were wary about the expansion of the white population of people who were not Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So it was not just the Irish and the Italians, but anybody from Central, Southern, or Eastern Europe who were legally considered white, who were coming in large numbers, but who were not Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So there was also a hierarchy within whiteness, a social hierarchy within whiteness, and there was discrimination against white people who were legally white, therefore immigrating in large numbers, but were not Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that is one of the reasons why the restrictive immigration laws of 1921 and 1924 implemented national quotas for those who were considered white, that is for Europeans, that put numerical restrictions on the migration of non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant Europeans. They were still allowed to migrate, but they were subject to numerical quotas for the period from 1924 through 1965. So there's degrees of whiteness, and they work differently in immigration law from in social discrimination. I also wanted to just say something about, you said that maybe the United States and South Africa were the only countries that implemented these legal systems for exploiting migrant workers, for bringing and exploiting migrant workers. But I would actually say that these legal systems for transporting and exploiting and deporting and denying rights and citizenship to migrant workers has been a constant for the past 500 years of European expansion, not just in the United States and South Africa, but by all of the European countries engaged in the colonial project, beginning with Spain and Portugal and expanding through pretty much all of the northern and some of the Central European countries. So, one of my students once pointed out, and I love the way he formulated it, the United States enacted slavery domestically inside its country. France outsourced its slavery. Like, France enslaved people too, but just not so much in France. They outsourced it to the Caribbean. And I would say it continues in all of those colonizing countries, whether it's the white settler colonial countries like Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, or whether it's the what we sometimes call extractive colonial countries like France and Britain, Italy, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, where the importation of cheap migrant labor and the exploitation of that labor and the denial of citizenship to that labor has just been a constant of European colonial expansion and of our current neo-colonial world order. And you can kind of draw the lines of the neo-colonial world order by looking at exploited labor migration and the legal structuring of exploited labor migration. Where are people fleeing and where are they coming to under extraordinarily repressive and exploitative conditions? It's still happening. So Miguel asked about, is Biden different from Trump? And I was just talking about that with one of my friends yesterday, because she was commenting how, we were talking about a case that just happened in Maine that I would like to bring to everyone's attention because it's a really horrifying case. This happened earlier not this month, it happened in March, where there was a raid on a house in a very small town in the middle of central Maine called Lisbon, Maine, where there were 17 migrant workers, 15 from Guatemala and 2 from Nicaragua. Has anybody heard of this raid? If Trump had been president, you would have heard of it, believe me. It started with a hit and run accident in late February or early March, where the Lisbon police arrested somebody after a hit and run accident and suspected that that person was an immigrant, so therefore notified Customs and Border Protection. CBP carried out a month-long investigation and ended it in mid-March by carrying out this raid on the house where these 17 workers were living. All of the workers were detained. They were taken up to Rangeley Border Patrol Station in northern Maine, where they were processed. 2 of them are still in detention, and the other 15 have been put into because they had open deportation orders. The other 15 have been returned to Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is where the company, it was a Massachusetts-based company that had contracted them in Lawrence and brought them up to Lisbon to work in Maine. All of them are, the other 15 are now back in Lawrence as their deportation proceedings are being processed. So all of them are being subjected to deportation. And the CBP put out a press release congratulating themselves on this heroic raid that they had carried out, because these were criminals who had broken US law, and they are a danger to all of us white people when we allow criminal activity like this to go unchecked. And everybody in Maine is safer now that these people have been arrested and deported. So we were talking about that case and how striking it is that it's not really getting much attention. And if this had happened under President Trump, everyone would be all up in arms. If it was happening in Florida, we would be up in arms because those bad Republicans are being so mean to immigrants. But Biden's policies on immigration, like, he's not as rude when he talks about immigrants as Trump is. He doesn't go out of his way to say rude things about immigrants, but his policies are barely any different from Donald Trump's policies. And, you know, if you go all the way back to the Bush administration, when workplace raids were the prevailing order, and when Obama came into office, he said, we're going to stop those workplace raids. Those are terrible. Those are people who just come here to work. They shouldn't be punished just for working. But it's still happening, and this is a perfect case. And interestingly enough, we do not know the name of the company. That is, all of the workers have been detained, but the company itself, nothing. Not even the name of the company has been released. So yeah, and I would also just say, you know, Biden talked nice about a lot of things when he was campaigning. And now that he's been in office, we've seen him backtrack on practically everything nice he said when he was campaigning. But again, I feel like a lot of liberal Democrats are just so relieved to have Trump out of office that they don't want to criticize Biden because they don't want to have to listen to Trump. And I agree, I don't want to have to listen to Trump either, but the policies matter more than the words. I mean, the words do matter, but the policies matter too. So Biden's idea on immigration, and reiterated by his vice president, Kamala Harris, who we kind of put in charge of the Central American problem, is, well, we're going to get to the roots of the problem, which are poverty, violence, but what both Biden and Harris have failed to do is ask about, well, what are the roots of poverty and violence? The roots of poverty and violence in Central America, which it's true, that is the cause of much of the migration, poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity. But what they neglect to ask is what's the cause of poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity? And since they neglect to ask that, their solution is to promote the exact same policies that have caused poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity. So the kinds of investment that they are proposing and enacting for Central America are exactly the kinds of investment that have led to the crisis that Central America is facing today. And a lot of that investment is in the military and in the militarization, not just of the US-Mexico border, but of the Mexico-Guatemala border and of Guatemala's southern border. So a huge influx of military so-called aid, which is not helping solve the problems of violence and poverty in Central America. Instead, it's exacerbating them. So Nubia asked, so what can we do? How can we solve the problem? And I guess I would say that we need to stop thinking of immigration as a domestic problem to be solved, and to think about global economic structures and the way the global economy functions, and especially the US, the role of the US corporations and US dominated international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, free trade agreements like the US Central America Free Trade Agreement, the US Colombia Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the ways that poor countries are not sovereign. That is, their political, social, and economic choices are determined by outside forces like transnational corporations, multinational lending agencies, international institutions, and free trade agreements with the United States. Individual free trade agreements and larger trade agreements like the GATT. And debt plays a huge role in the ways that these outside entities can force poor countries to enact the policies that are beneficial to foreign capital rather than to their own populations. So I really think that, like, the crisis, we do need to enact more humane policies towards those who are fleeing the disasters we have created in the third world. But that's not the solution. The solution is to address the economic, socioeconomic disasters that we have created and are continuing to reinforce day by day through debt, through multinationals, through trade agreements, and through international agencies on the countries of the third world, which we claim are sovereign, but which in fact have very little sovereignty to make their own decisions in favor of their own populations. Anna asked, to what extent are immigration policies still racialized? And I would say to a very large extent. And the case I was talking about in Maine is just one example, but the larger, both on the right and in the center, conceptualization that immigrants are somehow, well, immigrants I was talking about how throughout most of US history, the term immigrants referred only to white people and they were celebrated. But now immigrants refers primarily to people of color. And this is a shift since 1965. And anti-immigrant sentiment has risen and anti-immigrant legislation, like the militarization of the border, and the draconian policies against asylum and refugees, and all of those things have risen as the racial composition of the migrant stream has changed. So I almost feel like we use immigration status as the new stand-in to justify discrimination, legal discrimination against populations of color. Why are immigrants not allowed to vote? We take it as normal, but 100 years ago, white people took it as normal that people of color shouldn't be allowed in theaters or shouldn't be allowed to vote. So, okay, then African Americans are granted the right to vote, but then there's all this legislation that prevents them from voting. Oh, well, only people who are literate can vote. It's not about race, it's because they're not literate. Now we say it's not about race, it's because they're immigrants. That is the illegalizing of immigration and the legalized discrimination against immigrants of all statuses, legal and undocumented. The very concept of undocumentedness, all of those are updated 21st century forms of racial discrimination. And the person who wrote in the chat, whose name I did not get because it's hard for me to read the chat while I'm also listening and speaking. But the question, I mean, maybe I answered that question as I was answering Anna's question too, because that was kind of and what could be anti-racist policies. I mean, I really think that recognizing the racism in our immigration policies is an important step to addressing that.
Yeah, sim, obrigada, professora. Obrigada por ter respondido a todas as questões de forma bem específica e acho que, mais do que tudo, dando para a gente ainda dando para a gente ainda caminhos, né, do que a gente pode fazer daqui para frente. Acho que especialmente entendendo, denunciando essas políticas racistas e, a partir disso, pensar em novas formas e novas possibilidades de políticas antirracistas. Muito obrigada. Eu acho que o Luiz está na sala, o professor Luiz Fernando também do Instituto. Eu vou pedir para ele fazer uma saudação e, na verdade, fazer uma despedida, agradecendo a todos e todas por estarem aqui. Luiz, passo para você.
Oi, Mariana, obrigado. Queria, em nome do Instituto Lula, em primeiro lugar, agradecer à professora Aviva Chomsky pela palestra, pelo seminário, por essa participação hoje, por ter colaborado com a gente, com seus conhecimentos, com a sua pesquisa. Isso é muito importante para que a gente construa políticas mais justas, políticas mais democráticas e, inclusive, uma interlocução maior, né, dessa questão do imigrante, que é fundamental. Agradecer também você e ao Alvaro por essa parceria entre o Instituto Lula e o Instituto Diáspora Brasil. Eu acho que é muito importante, acho que temos, ouvindo hoje, temos mais coisas a colaborar e a problematizar. Isso é uma questão fundamental que, às vezes, a gente coloca numa ordem de prioridades que não é a real. Isso tem que estar entre as prioridades, e, às vezes, é colocado ao fundo de uma série de políticas públicas. Queria agradecer a todas e todos presentes nesse sábado e dizer que a gente tem mais 2 encontros, um no final de abril, no dia 22, com o professor Ricardo Antunes, e um no dia 6 de maio, com o professor Márcio Postman, ambos especialistas com abordagens diferentes, mas ambos especialistas na questão do trabalho e que vão tratar dessa questão do trabalho e da imigração. Professora Aviva, muito obrigado. Mariana, Alvaro, e
em nome de vocês, a todos aqui presentes, obrigado em nome do Instituto Lula, do Instituto Diáspora Brasil, e declaramos aí esse seminário encerrado. Um bom trabalho a todos nós.